And here on the Kharkov front, great changes have taken place in the last few months. Our full divisions have been withdrawn, and the Soviets have gone on the offensive. Just 1 or 2 days after our arrival, Soviet shells started falling on the city. Our aerodrome did not have a large supply of fuel or bombs, so another transfer to another, safer airfield was not unexpected. The new base was 150 kilometers to the south, near the village of Dmitrievka. As the distance to the front turned out to be quite long, we used 2 jump-off aerodromes, one in Barvenkovo, from where we fly to the Izium area, and the other in Stalino, for flights to the Mayas front. At each of these aerodromes there is a small group of mechanics who service our aeroplanes after flights. Defense lines have been established along the Donets and the Mayas, which are under heavy Soviet attack. Often our operations officer assigns us the same old target, the same forest, the same ravine. We soon do without reading maps and other nonsense. As Steen once said, we're big boys now. During one of our first sorties to the Izium area, someone calls on the radio, "Henelora, that's my call sign, aren't you the guy who was chopping nuts for us?" I don't answer, and he repeats his question over and over again. Suddenly I recognize that voice. It is one of the intelligence officers with whom we often interacted, and with whose division we always reached the best understanding. Of course, this is against the rules of secrecy, but I cannot help but be tempted and reply that I was indeed stabbing nuts. Tanks for them. And he himself, as far as I remember, was fond of football. He immediately admits this, and all the cheering crews who heard our conversation dive towards the furiously barking anti-aircraft guns. This Luftwaffe intelligence officer, surnamed EP, was one of the best centre forwards in the Viennese football team. As he was attached to a unit in the thick of the battle, I would meet him often. Captain Anton, who took command of 9-1 Squadron after Horner's death, was killed at the Mayas. His plane exploded on the way out of the dive in the same inexplicable manner as it had done several times before. Once again, one of our old-timers, a Knight's Iron Cross recipient, is killed. Some crews die, others take their place, no one stays long, the merciless rhythm of war. We could already feel the onset of autumn. When we received the order to take part in sorties to the Dnieper front, even further west. For many days we have been flying missions from an aerodrome northwest of Krasnoyarskoye. Here the Soviets are tearing into the Donetsk industrial area from the east and northeast. Apparently this is a large-scale operation. The enemy is everywhere. In addition to this, they make continuous raids on our airfield with Boston bombers. This is a great nuisance because service during the raids has to be stopped, and we are late with our sorties. During these raids we sit in slots dug behind the planes and wait for the Ivan to run out of fun. Fortunately, our losses in aircraft and equipment are relatively low. No one tells us that the army units passing our aerodrome are almost the latest, and Ivan is following on their heels. Very little time passes and we are convinced of this ourselves. We take off from the western aerodrome and fly over the city, gaining altitude. We are to attack enemy troops 40 kilometers to the northeast. Being over the other end of the town, I see in the distance, and at some distance 6 to 8 tanks. They are camouflaged and look like our own vehicles. Nevertheless, the shape of their hulls seems quite odd to me. My musings are interrupted by Henschel. Let's have a look at those German tanks on the way back. We're flying towards the target. Much further west I encounter strong enemy units, no sign of German troops. We fly back and see these tanks at close range. They are all T-34s, Russians. Their crews are standing behind the vehicles, studying the map. Apparently they are being briefed. Frightened by our appearance, they scatter and climb into their tanks. But at this point we can't do anything because we must first land and replenish our ammunition. Meanwhile, the Soviets are entering the city. Our aerodrome is located on the other side of it. 10 minutes later I take off again and look for these tanks among the houses. When they are attacked, the tanks turn sharply, hide behind the houses and quickly disappear from sight. I destroy 4 of them. Where did the others go? They could show up at our airfield any minute. We can't evacuate it because some of the ground personnel are in the city and we have to wait for them to come back. Only now I remember that I sent one of our officers to the army depots on the east side of the city. He was unusually lucky. It later transpired that his vehicle had touched down the very second the T-34 rounded the corner of the warehouse building. Giving full throttle and squeezing his knees tightly so they wouldn't shake so much, he was able to drive away unharmed. I'm taking off again. The squadron can't fly with me or we won't have enough fuel for the inevitable flight to Pavlovka. I can only hope that by the time I return all our men will have already gathered at the aerodrome. After a long search, I spot 2 tanks in the western part of the town and destroy them. Apparently they were moving in our direction to smoke out the hornet's nest of Stukas. It's about time to get away, and having had time to set fire to all the faulty aeroplanes, we take off. As we circle over the aerodrome to line up in battle order, I see tank shells bursting on the edge of the aerodrome. They eventually manage to reach our base, but we are no longer there. The compass points west-northwest. A little while later we fly over the road at low altitude. We are being heavily fired upon by a motorized column moving under the protection of tanks. We split up and start circling over the vehicle's Soviet tanks and lorries, mostly American-made, hence it's the Russians. I admit I'm puzzled as to how these guys ended up so far to the west, but it can only be the Russians. We gain altitude and I give the order to attack the anti-aircraft installations, which must be neutralized first, so that we can launch attacks from low altitude without interference. After we have pacified most of the anti-aircraft guns, we split the column apart and shoot it up. The day is slowly going towards sunset. The whole road looks like a fiery snake. It is a continuous traffic jam of burning vehicles and tanks that failed to turn off the road to the right or left. We have spared no one. The material losses of the Soviets are great again. But what is it? I fly over 3 or 4 vehicles ahead of the column. On their radiators are our flags. They are German-made lorries. White signal flares are flying out of the ditches on either side of the road. This is the signal of our own troops. I haven't had that chilling feeling in my stomach in a long time. I'd love to crash into the ground somewhere right here. Could this column be German? Everything's on fire. But why were we coming under so much truck fire? How did American vehicles end up here? On top of that, I saw with my own eyes men in brown uniforms running. Sweat streaming down my face. A numbing sense of panic gripped me. It is completely dark when we land in Pavlovka. None of us utters a word. Was this column German? Uncertainty suffocates us. I have no way of finding out over the phone from the army or the Luftwaffe whose column it was. By midnight, a few soldiers arrive. The operations officer interrupts my extremely restless sleep and says there is important news. Our army colleagues want to thank us for helping them escape. They tell us that their lorries were overrun by an enemy convoy. They only had time to run away 100 meters to take cover from Russian fire in ditches away from the road. It was at that moment that we appeared on the scene and shot the Ivans. Our guys immediately took advantage of the situation and managed to escape. This relieves me of a heavy burden, and I share the jubilation of our fellow soldiers. Some time after this incident, we find ourselves in Dnipropetrovsk. The airfield is on the eastern bank of the Dnieper, very far from our barracks in the center of the city. For an ordinary Russian city, the place makes a good impression, the same as Kharkov. Soviet bombers and attack planes attack the bridges on the Dnieper in the center of the city almost every day. The Reds hope that by destroying them, they will cut off the retreat of the German troops and make it impossible to supply ammunition and reserves to our army group. So far, we have not seen that they have had any success in their attacks on the bridge. But the inhabitants are triumphant. As soon as the Soviet aeroplanes disappear from sight, they rush to the Dnieper with baskets, because they have had time to notice that after each raid a large number of stunned fish appear on the surface. It seems that they haven't eaten so much fish in the city for a long time. We fly northeast and south as the Soviets move forward towards the Dnieper in the hope of preventing our defense line along the river and consolidating positions. At the same time as we move our base from Dnipropetrovsk to Bolshaya Kostromka, 120 kilometers further west, I lose Becker. He's been transferred to Air Division headquarters. For a long time I resist his transfer because he belongs to our family circle, but it is useless, and after long negotiations the final decision is made. Bolshaya Kostromka is a typical Russian village, with all the advantages and disadvantages that come from it. For us, Central Europeans, the disadvantages outweigh the advantages. The village is highly scattered and consists mainly of mud brick huts, with only a few houses built of stone. The street network has sprung up by itself. Without any plan, it is simply unpaved carriageways which intersect at the most bizarre angles. In bad weather, our vehicles sink into the mud up to their axles, so much so that it is impossible to get them out. The airfield is located at the northern end of the village, on the road to Apostolovo, which is almost impassable for vehicles. Therefore, our staff wastes no time and, in order to maintain mobility, begins to use horses and oxen harnessed to wagons. Crews often have to approach their aircraft on horseback. They climb onto the wing of their aircraft, right from the saddle, because the runway looks little better than the roads. In these weather conditions, it resembles an ocean of mud with tiny islands, and if it weren't for the wide tires of the U-87, we wouldn't be able to take off at all. Our accommodation is scattered all over the village. The squadron headquarters is quartered in the school building on its southern edge. Here we even have an officer's canteen. The square in front of the building is often turned into a huge puddle, and when it freezes, which sometimes happens, we play hockey here. Ebersbach and Fickel never miss an opportunity to play. Recently, however, they have cooled down a bit, and their legs are all bruised. When the weather turns bad, the hockey gates are moved under the roof, the reduced hockey field giving the goalies more trouble. The furniture doesn't suffer from hockey, because it simply isn't there. The Russians are shocked by the many small items our soldiers carry with them. They think all these amateur pictures of our houses, our rooms, our girls are propaganda. We have to spend a lot of time to convince them that all this is genuine, that the Germans are not cannibals at all. A few days after we arrived, the Russians came up and asked if they could put icons and crucifixes back on the walls. Previously, under the Soviet regime, they had to hide it all because of the disapproval of their son, daughter, or commissar. The fact that we do not raise any objections seems to encourage them. We try to explain to them that we too have crucifixes and religious pictures in our houses, but they believe it with great difficulty. Hastily they put up icons in the red corners and express again and again the hope that this permission will not be cancelled. They live in fear of the commissars, who keep the whole village under surveillance and spy on its inhabitants. The post of chief informer is often held by the headmaster. At present we live in an enchanted kingdom of mud and experience the consequent difficulties in supplies, even food. When I fly low over the Dnieper, I often see both our and Russian troops throwing hand grenades into the water and catching stunned fish. We are at war. The front line runs along the Dnieper, but every opportunity to feed the troops must be seized. So one day I decide to try my luck with a small 50 kilograms bomb. Goslar, our quartermaster, is sent at the head of a group of non-uniformed soldiers to the Dnieper. Before they leave, I show them on the map the section of the river where I intend to drop the bomb. After circling a little over the river and waiting until I could identify our guys, I throw the bomb from a height of 15 to 20 meters. It falls near the bank and after a short delay explodes. Ours below must have been startled by the explosion because they throw themselves to the ground. A few savvy fishermen, who were fishing in the middle of the river from the side of some ancient vessel that almost capsized from the wave caused by the explosion, quickly swim up and start picking up the stunned fish. From above I can see the white bellies of dead fish floating on the surface. The soldiers enter the fray and try to pull out as many fish as they can. More fishermen appear on the shore, and also start throwing fish onto the shoal. A few hours after my return, a truck with a fishing party returns from the Dnieper, bringing with it several centners of fish. Among the catch are several huge specimens weighing 30–40 kilograms, mostly sturgeons and a type of river carp. For the next 10 days we organize real orgies and find the fish diet excellent. Sturgeon, smoked or boiled, is the most tasty. Huge carps are also quite edible. A couple of weeks later, a second fishing expedition is organized with equal success. We fly out on combat missions almost every day and in many different directions. To the east and southeast, Soviet guns, concentrated near Melitopol, continue artillery bombardment of our Nikopol bridgehead. Among the names on the map there are many German ones: Heidelberg, Gruntal, Gustafeld. Here are the houses of German settlers, whose great-grandfathers developed this area several centuries ago. To the north of us, near Zaporozhye, the front turns to the east and passes along the Dnieper. Still further away, after it crosses the river, the Kremenchug sector begins. Behind the Russian lines remain Dnipropetrovsk. In their usual fashion, the Soviets apply pressure in various places, and they often succeed in breaking through the front to a shallow depth. The situation is restored by counterattacks, usually carried out by armoured divisions. There is a concrete airstrip in the industrial centre of Krivoy Rog, which is to the north of us, right on the front line. But we can't use it. One morning the Soviet attack reaches Krivoy Rog and our airfield. The main blow comes from the north, from the direction of Pyaty-Hatka. This is where Captain Mendigo's missing. Despite the most desperate searches, we cannot find our good comrade, who has been swallowed up by the vast expanses of Russia. The situation here is also restored by a counterattack, and the front shifts a few kilometers to the east. The supply of our troops goes on without interference, and we soon switch to the bridges across the Dnieper. Then our target becomes the enemy grouping between Kremenchug and Dnipropetrovsk. One morning, when a new Russian offensive from the north begins, I have to fly out in bad weather. My task is to get a general picture of the enemy troops' disposition and to assess the chances of a successful attack by larger forces. Before the flight, I am informed that one of the villages in the battle zone is still held by our troops, but they are under constant attack and urgently need help. This unit is to be contacted, and an air gunner is already on the ground. Our trio is heading into the target area under low clouds. I hear the voice of a familiar air gunner in my headphones and hope that it is him and not some other officer that I have been ordered to liaise with. I should mention here that each air gunner wants our support for his own division. We have to insist on being told the call sign of the unit in question. The demand for us is so great that we would need 20 times as many men and aircraft to fulfill all the requests. From the sound of his voice, it sounds like Epp the football player is talking to me again. But even without his help, I have already noticed the concentration of enemy troops 3 kilometers ahead. I am still flying over our positions when suddenly, tilting the machine, I see flashes from the shots of many anti-aircraft guns. I do not see the bursts of shells because they are hidden by clouds, but suddenly I feel hits in the cabin and in the engine. I feel shrapnel in my face and hands. The engine is ready to stop at any second. It runs for a couple of minutes more and then stops. During this time, I discover a meadow to the west of the village. I'm sure the Russians haven't spotted me yet. Fickle quickly sits down next to me. We have no idea how much longer our troops will be able to hold their positions, so Henschel and I take the essentials weapons, watches and parachutes and climb into Fickle's car. The third plane from our group has already flown home and the pilot reports the passage. Soon we land successfully in Kostromka. These days, Captain Fritsch is also lucky. After he was shot down by fighters southeast of Zaporozhye, near Heidelberg, he successfully ejected with a parachute, but hit his tail feathers. After a brief stay in hospital, this excellent pilot, awarded the Knight's Cross, returned to action. But we're not always so lucky. One day, returning from the front line, we are already flying to our aerodrome and start to land one by one. Russian fighters appear high above us. They have absolutely no intention of attacking us, but the anti-aircraft guns open fire on them, trying to shoot between our aircraft. Hurling, the 7th Squadron commander, and Krumings, our engineering officer, are hit and go down. Moments later, Fritsch is killed as well. 3 inseparable friends, awarded Knight's Crosses, have given their lives for their country. We are stunned by this loss. They were first-class pilots and comrades to their subordinates. Sometimes there are periods here at the front when it is as if a curse has fallen on people, and the series of misfortunes seems endless. In November, I received a radio message I had been awarded the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and was to arrive for the awarding at the Führer's headquarters in East Prussia. At about the same time, I destroy my 100th tank. I am delighted with this award, not least because it is a contribution to my squadron's achievements, but at the same time I am upset that the response to my recommendation to award Henschel the Knight's Cross has not yet arrived. It must have got stuck somewhere. In any case, I decide to take my flight gunner to be honoured. Henschel has just finished his 1000th combat flight, and having on his account several Soviet fighters, is without any exaggeration considered to be our best gunner. Through Vinnitsa, Proskurov, Lvov and Krakow we fly to East Prussia, where in the area of Gold-Up is the headquarters of the Führer. First we land at Lotzen. I report my arrival to Lieutenant Colonel von Beloff. He tells me that at the same time with me, Major Habak will receive the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. I have brought Henschel with me and asked Beloff if my recommendation has arrived. He answers me that not yet, but immediately promises to find out from the Reichsmarshal in what condition is the case. There, too, cannot find these papers and assume that the documents have been handed over to the Reichsmarshal for signature. Von Beloff negotiates everything in words with Goering, goes directly to the Führer, and reports to him that I brought Henschel with me for the above-mentioned reasons, and that the Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe has already approved the award. The reply comes back. Henschel is to appear with the others. This is a great event for my faithful flight gunner. Only a few receive the Knight's Cross from the hands of the Führer himself, because the personal investiture of the Commander-in-Chief begins with the oak leaves. And so Major Habak, Henschel and I stand in formation in the presence of the Führer. First, he pins our awards and after the ceremony has tea with us in his office. He talks about past operations in the East and the lessons to be learnt from them. He tells us that new units are now being built up, which will undoubtedly be needed to repel the Western Allied landings in Europe. A large number of divisions can still be formed in the country, and our industry will be able to supply them with sufficient armament. Meanwhile, the German technical genius, he informed us, continues to work on marvelous projects which will enable us to wrest final victory from the hands of Bolshevism. He is convinced that only the Germans are up to the task. He is proud of his soldiers on the Eastern Front. He knows of their gigantic efforts and the difficulties they face. He is good-looking, full of ideas and confidence in the future. Leaving Lützen, we have to turn off to Görlitz, where we give our brave U-87 a 2-day rest. Henschel's home is in Saxony, not so far from here, and he leaves by train to meet me again in 2 days before our flight to the front. Then, in bad weather, we fly through Vienna, Krakow, Lvov, Vinica, and Kirovograd. The further east we get, the more the imminent onset of winter is felt. Low clouds and thick snow interfere with our flight and make it difficult to orientate ourselves. We feel much better when, already at dusk, our machine rolls over the frozen flying field in Kostromka, and we are home again, together with our comrades. The cold weather has already set in here, but we have no reason to complain about it, as the frost improves the condition of the roads in the village. The large open spaces are covered with solid ice, and without skates they can be difficult to cross. When we don't fly because of bad weather, we resume our game of hockey. Even those who are least inclined to the sport are infected by the enthusiasm of the others. We use any usable equipment, from real hockey sticks to old brooms and shovels. Primitive Russian skates compete with special shoes equipped with proper hockey blades. Many clumsily run around in fur umbrellas. Only sporting excitement is important. Here in the south of Russia we have occasional warm days that turn everything back into an impenetrable swamp. Perhaps it has something to do with the influence of the Black or Azov seas. Our aerodrome cannot withstand such vicissitudes of climate, and so we have to move to a concrete runway in Kirovograd. One of such periods coincides with Christmas and New Year. Accordingly, the crews who find themselves in Kirovograd have to celebrate the holidays in isolation instead of the squadron's general party. Father Frost prepared gifts for each soldier, but looking at their faces no one would have guessed that for them it was already the 5th military winter. In early 1944, the bad weather recedes and operations become more and more intense. The Soviets tear west and southwest from the Dnepropetrovsk area and briefly cut the communication between Kryvyi Rog and Kirovograd. The counter-offensive conducted by our old friends, the 14th and 24th Armoured Divisions, proves to be extremely successful. In addition to capturing a large number of prisoners and equipment, we managed to achieve a lull, at least temporary, in this sector. We fly constantly from Kirovograd and are stationed near the aerodrome. The headquarters is stationed nearby. On the day they arrive, a most unpleasant surprise awaits them. The regimental adjutant, Major Becker, nicknamed Fridolin, and the officer-engineer Captain Katchner are not quite familiar with the local stoves. During the night, carbon dioxide builds up in their room, and when Katchner gets out of bed, he finds Fridolin unconscious. He staggered out into the fresh air and carried Fridolin out with him, saving the lives of both of them. For a soldier to lose his life to a stupid accident rather than enemy action is particularly tragic. We later see the funny side of it, and their misadventure becomes a common joke. They constantly have to fight off pranks. At this time, during our combat sorties, we witness a most unusual drama. I fly out with other anti-tank aircraft to an area southeast of Alexandria. Having discharged all our ammunition, we go home to Kirovograd to refuel and replenish the stock of shells before a new flight. We fly halfway to Kirovograd and fly over a dense grove. Tanks are moving under us. I recognize them immediately. They are T-34s, heading north. In a flash, I gain altitude and circle over my prey. Where the hell did they come from? It's the Russians, no doubt about it. We don't have any shells left, so we have to leave them alone. Who knows where they'll get to by the time we can come back with a new supply of shells and attack them? The T-34s pay no attention to us and go on their way, skirting the grove. Further to the north, there is still some moving on the ground. We fly there at low altitude and recognize the German TIV tanks. The tankers glare at us from their vehicles, thinking about anything but the proximity of the enemy and a possible fight. The two groups of tanks are moving towards each other, separated only by a small strip of bushes. Neither side can see the other as the Soviets are moving in a hollow parallel to the railway embankment. I fire red flares, swing my wings and drop a note in my container informing my fellow tankers who is moving in their direction and is already 3 kilometers away, assuming both sides maintain their course. Descending sharply over the spot where the T-34s are now moving, I clue our tankers in to the proximity of the enemy. The two parties slowly converge. We circle above them and wait to see what will happen next. Our tanks stop where there is a gap of a few meters in the hedge. At any minute, both sides may suddenly see each other at point-blank range. I wait with suspense for a few seconds for both sides to experience the shock. The Russians close the turret hatches. Perhaps they have become suspicious as they watch our desperate maneuvers. They are following all in the same direction, moving fast. The distance separating the two parties is now down to 10 to 15 meters. And here it comes. The Russians moving along the hollow have reached the gap and see the enemy right in front of them. The first TIV takes exactly 2 seconds to fire at his opponent from a distance of 15 meters. It explodes and burns, shrapnel flying into the air. In the next few seconds, so far, I have not seen one of the remaining T-34s fired. 6 Russian tanks are engulfed in flames. The impression is that they are completely taken by surprise, and even now have not yet realized what is happening. A few T-34s move under cover of the hedge even closer. Others try to get behind the railway embankment. They find themselves in the line of sight of German tanks, which open fire over the hedge. The whole battle lasts no more than a minute. This is a unique duel in its own way. Without losses on our side, all T-34s are destroyed. Our comrades on the ground are proud of their success. We are delighted, no less. We throw them a note with best wishes and a bar of chocolate and fly home. After a series of relatively quiet sorties, it usually doesn't take long before we get another jolt. The 3 of us take off, Oberleutnants Fickel and Stoller accompanying me on a tank hunt. We have no fighter escort, and as we fly past one of our armoured units, 12 to 15 Aerocobras appear with very aggressive intentions. They all have their noses painted red and look like they belong to some elite unit. At the very ground, a wild commotion begins, and I am glad that I was able to bring my colleagues home safely, even though our aeroplanes were not without damage. Our experience is often the subject of evening arguments and reminiscences, Fickel and Stoller believing that we were saved only by a miracle. At the same time, the argument is a useful lesson for our rookies, teaching them the proper choice of evasive tactics in air combat. One of our squadrons was for some time stationed at Zlinka, north of Novo-Ukrainka and west of us. My 3rd squadron also receives orders to move there with all flight personnel, while the ground personnel move on the road to Pervomaisk. At the end of our stay in Kirovograd, Notification of my promotion arrives and I am promoted to the rank of major. In Zlinka, it feels as if a real winter has arrived. Almost every day the prickly east wind blows. The temperature drops to 20 to 30 degrees below zero. The impact of the cold affects the number of combat-ready aircraft because maintenance and repair in the open at these temperatures has its own peculiarities. We are particularly unlucky because the shock wedges of the Russian offensive north of Kirovograd have just penetrated the neck of the valley near the village of Marinovka. The Russians are bringing in very strong reserves there in the hope of consolidating their positions, which will serve as a springboard for a new offensive. Every aircraft that is even remotely airworthy is being used for low-altitude attacks. During one of the sorties in the eastern direction, Hauptmann Fickel comes under heavy fire and makes an emergency landing. The terrain is relatively flat and I am able to land next to him and take them aboard with the gunner. After a short time we return to our airfield, having become poorer by one more aircraft. Russian tanks rarely attack at night, but over the next few days we, and especially our colleagues to the north, get a taste of this dish as well. At midnight, my intelligence officer excitedly wakes me up and reports that several men from the fighter squadron stationed at Little Whiskey have just arrived asking to fly out immediately. The Soviets have broken into their aerodrome and into the very village where the personnel are stationed. It is a cloudless, starry night. I decide to talk to the refugees myself. Mali Whiskey is 30 kilometers to the north and several Luftwaffe units are stationed at their airfield. We can only say that when we were sleeping, suddenly we heard a rumble, and when we looked around, Russian tanks with infantry on armor were already coming past. Another soldier described the invasion of the airfield by tanks. It all happened very close, and obviously they were taken by surprise, because they were wearing nothing but their underwear. I weigh up the situation and conclude that there is no point in taking off now. I need relatively good visibility to hit the tank. It's not good enough even with a clear, starry sky. We'll have to wait till dawn. It's pointless to drop a few bombs just to get a breeze on the infantry, especially with German units standing there. Their maintenance units, almost helpless against Soviet tanks. We're supposed to take off at dawn. Unfortunately, on the way back, we will have to reckon with the fog, which already looks suspicious. We approach the airfield at low altitude and see our heavy anti-aircraft guns in action. They have already taken out some of the more enterprising monsters. The rest are hiding in cover and out of range. All personnel are in position. When we fly over the aerodrome, they do the usual military dance, as they have no doubt that we will help them get out of their predicament. One T-34 drove right into the ground control tower and stands there tilted on its side amidst the wreckage. Some have taken cover in the factory area. The approach is obstructed by high pipes. We must be extremely careful not to crash into them. Our cannon fire is heard throughout the village. We're also dropping bombs. Those Ivans who have advanced the furthest are beginning to realize that they had better trumpet a retreat. For the most part, they are tearing towards the eastern exit of the village, where they can take cover in the many ravines. This is also where their lorries of ammunition and shells are parked. They hope to hold us at bay with their light and medium anti-aircraft guns, but we pelt their positions with bombs and open fire on them with guns, putting them out of action. Soon the lorries catch fire and start exploding one after another. The Ivans are being carried through the snow to the east. Our most difficult job for the day is landing at Zlinka, as the fog over the aerodrome in no way wants to lift. And when we come in for a landing, visibility is extremely limited. By nightfall, the squadron makes 7 sorties, mine and 1 other aircraft flying 15 times each. Small whiskey cleared of the enemy, 16 enemy tanks destroyed from the air. Shortly after this episode, our flying personnel join our ground services at Pervomaysk-Severny. The aerodrome here has a small concrete strip, but it is not used except by aircraft standing on it. This prevents them sinking into the mud. It is almost impossible to take off, land or taxi on the ground. The whole place is like a quagmire. Next to the flying field is a small farmhouse in which we are lodged. After the flights and on those days when the weather is bad, Gadaman and I do exercises. After a long-distance cross-country run, we take a hot and cold bath and then roll naked in the snow in front of the house. The feeling after this procedure is simply unforgettable. It is the same as being born again. Some Pans and Panenka who happen to pass by at that moment look at us with amazement. I hope that our athletic appearance alone disproves their propaganda about uncultured Germans. Without weather reconnaissance, the morning sorties in large groups into this sector proved to be a waste of time. The area in which the targets were located could be covered by fog, and then they could not be attacked. Flying at random would be a waste of precious fuel. Not to mention the fact that bad weather conditions could be fatal for large groups and inexperienced crews. Therefore, the order was given that a weather reconnaissance aircraft should be sent at dawn each time, and its report on the weather conditions in the area of the intended target would determine whether we would take off or not. The task is too important for me to send the first man on such a patrol. Fickle or someone else should fly with him if the lieutenant needs a rest. One morning we are heading towards the front. I take advantage of the favourable weather and we take off before the final dawn. I try to memorize the whole front in this sector. In the twilight I can clearly see the flashes of the enemy's guns. Judging from the intensity of the artillery fire, we can guess the enemy's intentions for the day. As soon as artillery positions can be located, they are mapped. It will not be long before they cannot be seen from the air, and so it is likely that a few hours later they will be bombed by Stukas. This intelligence information is also of great interest to our colleagues on the ground. If I flew low over the front line that morning, I can give the army accurate information about the enemy's staging areas. In this way, all possible surprises can be countered that day. It is an impressive picture, and to me up there, the flashes of enemy guns in the semi-darkness remind me of a huge railway station, on the platform of which lighters are lit and extinguished. Threads of fire, on which are strung bright and dark beads, overtake me and form a kind of connecting line with the ground. The enemy defences have spotted us. Bright-coloured signal flares soar upwards. These are the signals exchanged between units on the ground. Gradually, during our regular morning visits, we begin to get closer and closer to the Ivans. This causes them particular annoyance, because in these early hours we often take their tanks by surprise. They also want to take advantage of the beginning of the day to achieve surprise and opens fire on me. One can understand Ivan sending Red Falcons to clear the front shortly after dawn. We often fight with the Red Falcons. These manoeuvres are not particularly favourable for us when the enemy is numerically outnumbered and without the protection of fighters. During this phase of the fighting, Fickle looks very exhausted, and Gadaman advises me to let him rest for a while, or at least release him from these sorties with me. Even though Fickle says half-jokingly when he remarks after landing in a badly damaged aircraft that this mission took another 5 years off my life, I can see for myself that he is not an athlete and that even his stamina has its limits. But I am grateful that he does not refuse to accompany me on these sorties, and at times like this I always feel that combat friendship is truly a very bright feeling. Our morning reconnaissance is concentrated in the area northwest and southwest of Kirovograd, where the Soviets are making more and more attempts to break through with their inexhaustible mass. If the weather is even remotely flyable, we take off with the whole squadron half an hour after our first landing to attack those important targets we have just scouted. Now it is winter and the thick fog makes all observations more of a guessing game, and we take off without any certainty that we will be able to land here in an hour. The impenetrable fog descends on the ground unexpectedly and can hang around for hours. When the weather is like this, a car would be more useful than an aeroplane. Once we make a sortie with Fickle, we have already finished our reconnaissance and conducted several attacks from low altitude in the vicinity of Kirovograd. It is now quite light, and we are flying west, heading home. We still have halfway to go, but on reaching Nova Ukrainka we suddenly find ourselves in thick fog. Fickle stays very close to me so as not to lose sight of me. As we fly over the village, I barely manage to spot a few tall stovepipes. The ground is almost invisible. The upper edge of the fog rises to a great height, so we may not be able to fly over it. Somewhere we will have to go down again. Who knows what area is covered by these weather conditions? Hold a westerly course for as long as fuel lasts and count on luck, and then maybe make a landing in territory occupied by guerrillas. That's no way out either. We would soon reach our positions, and I might be urgently needed. Besides, after our long reconnaissance flight, we have very little fuel left, so the only thing left is to stay close to the ground and try to reach our aerodrome in poor visibility. All around is a continuous grey shroud. There's no horizon line. Fickle's plane disappeared. I haven't seen it since we flew over Novo Ukrainka. Maybe it hit a stovepipe? We can fly through this wall of fog as long as the terrain stays flat. As soon as there is an obstacle ahead, a telegraph pole, trees or a hill, I have to pull the control stick towards me and immediately plunge into this impenetrable pea soup. To probe my way out of this fog in this way would be very risky. You can see the ground from a height of no more than 3 to 4 meters, but at such a height some obstacles can appear quite unexpectedly. I fly only by compass, and judging by the clock, I should already be 20 minutes flight from my aerodrome at Pervomaisk. Now either the plane will give way to hills or the fog will become thicker. I have just barely avoided some high poles. I had had enough. Henschel, we're landing? Where exactly to land I have no idea, because I can barely see anything, just one grey haze. I release the flaps and take off the throttle. I keep the aircraft at low speed and feel the wheels touching the ground. The landing goes smoothly, and after a short run we come to a stop. Henschel pulls back the lantern and jumps out with a wide grin. We got lucky this time. Visibility on the ground is no more than 40 meters. We're presumably on a small hillock, the fog dripping off it somewhere downhill. I hear something that sounds like the sound of a running car engine and ask Henschel to walk back a little and look. Perhaps it's a road. As he walks, I sit motionless in my trusty U-87, and once again am glad to be alive. Henschel is coming back. My hunch turns out to be correct. There is a road running behind us. The army drivers told him that Pervomaisk is about 30 kilometers away, and that this road leads directly to it. We get into the plane, start the engine and turn out onto the road. Visibility is still no more than 30 meters, at best up to 40. We drive down the wide motorway as if in a car, obeying the usual rules of the road and letting heavy lorries pass. Where there are more cars, I stop to avoid an accident, just in case drivers don't see my aeroplane and drive straight into it. Many of them think they see a ghost plane. and so I drive for about 2 hours, going up the hill and down the hill. Then we come to a junction. There's no way I can get through it with my wings, so I pull off the road. Here I leave the plane. There are about 10 kilometers to Pervomaysk. An army car passing by gives me a lift, and I soon find myself in the car park of our aircraft. Soon Henschel, who remained sentry near the car, is replaced. Our comrades had already started to worry about us, as we couldn't have been in the air for long with so much fuel and no calls from anywhere, and are now jubilant about our return. Still no sign of Fickle. We are greatly alarmed. By midday the fog clears, I reach my aeroplane and take off right off the road. A few minutes later I land at our aerodrome, and our faithful mechanics ogle the aircraft like the prodigal son. After lunch, another sortie. When I go in, Gaderman tells me that Fickle has just called from Novo-Ukrainka. He and the flight gunner were able to get out of the fog safely. He lost me when the fog got thicker and immediately went in for a landing. Now this is where we rejoice for real. Shortly after these events, the centre of gravity of our operations shifts further south. German troops are surrounded in the Cherkasy area, and with the help of fresh reserves an operation to rescue them must be undertaken. The attack to unblock the cauldron will be launched from the south and southwest. We support the 11th and 13th Panzer Divisions, which have struck north from the area west of Novi Mirgorod, and have reached the river beyond which the Soviets have been able to fortify themselves well. There are many excellent targets for us here. Air activity is high on both sides. Iron Gustavs are trying to imitate us by attacking our tank divisions and their supply units. With our slow U-87s, we do our best to disperse and drive away these IL-2s, but they are a little faster than us because they have retractable landing gear. They are also much better armoured and much heavier. This is especially noticeable during an attack. They can pick up speed very quickly. But since we are usually busy striking from low altitudes, there is no time to fight them anyway. During this phase I get lucky during one of the fights with the Iron Gustavs. All our planes are involved in bombing Soviet fortified positions in the forest. I'm circling over them because I'm flying a plane with anti-tank guns and haven't found a single tank to attack yet. Ahead, diagonally to our course and 300 meters below, is a group of IL-2s escorted by Lehr and Aerocobras. My wingman is carrying bombs. I tell him that we are attacking the Isles. We've already started our descent. When I approach them at a distance of 100 meters, I see that I can't get closer to them, because the Elias are again flying faster than me. What's more, the fighters are starting to get interested in me. 2 of them have already made a combat turn behind me. It's a bit far to aim, but I've already caught one of those clumsy birds in my sights and I fire one shot from each anti-tank gun. Gustav turns into a bright orange ball and disintegrates into small fiery particles. The others seem to have realized where the wind is blowing from. They are being carried down even faster, and the distance between them is increasing before my eyes. Besides, it's a good time for me to start evasive action, because there are already fighters on the tail of my villain plane. My evasive tactics bring me closer to the squadron, and the Russians move away. No doubt they thought that our escort fighters were nearby and shooting me down would prove to be no easy task. In the afternoon, Oberleutnant Kuntz did not return from a combat sortie in the same sector. With 70 victories to his credit, he topped the list of tank fighters. His luck started with Belgorod and Kharkov, and he had gained a lot of experience since then. His loss is a blow to us all, and another breach in our circle of comradeship. The general offensive to unblock the units surrounded in the Cherkasy area is going well, and our shock troops managed to punch a passage into the cauldron. As soon as contact is established, the front here is pushed westwards. We fly from Pervomaisk to Rakovka. The area of Novo-Mirgorod remains far behind the Russian lines. A short time after completing their mission over German territory, American bombers land in Novo-Mirgorod. Their Russian allies help prepare the planes for another sortie. The operating base of these aircraft is in the Mediterranean. However, to the south of us the situation is also changing and our troops are abandoning the Nikopol bridgehead. The Soviets are tearing forward in the Nikolaev area, and the German divisions northwest of the city are engaged in the heaviest fighting.